Hey, what's up, everybody? Remember, The Science of Memory and the Art of Forgetting by Lisa Genova. This book was recommended to me by an acquaintance at work a while back, and after that last book, The Seven Sins of Memory, I was hungry for more on memory, and this book was pretty satiating. The guy who recommended this is an MD, so I went into it with pretty high expectations. So, Lisa Genova is a neuroscientist from Harvard and a pretty successful author. You might recognize her from her famous TED Talk she delivered. I haven't seen it, but usually they'll just do a summary of one of their books, so I'm assuming that's what it was. So, this book, remember, I'm going to bring up the Seven Sins of Memory throughout this review because A, I just read it right before this one, and B, they're fairly similar. In fact, there were a couple times that I was thinking, this lady probably just read The Seven Sins of Memory and then decided she wanted to write a book. It did feel like that in some places. After all, both books are about the same thing, memory. So, Remember was written in a totally different style than The Seven Sins. This book was more accessible and targeted toward a wider audience. This book would be a very good starter for someone who isn't already interested in the brain or things like memory specifically. For what it is, this book was very well written, but there were some issues I had with it. Lisa seems to have a very sociable style that comes out in her writing. I could see how this book could be pretty divisive. While overall I thought it was really good, there was a lot of stuff in there that I was not into. Like, this book was a very shallow but very broad look at what memory is and how it works. But what you can't get around is the author's personality coming through. If reading Seven Sins of Memory felt like attending a lecture, then this book felt like hanging out with a friend who is a neuroscientist. Lisa spent, in my opinion, too much time talking about herself and her world rather than just delivering the information. And there was a very pretentious line in there about how maybe you'll see her in a book signing line where you can thank her for teaching you. I couldn't help but think, yeah, it's a good book, but you have not impressed me enough to want to go get my book signed. Get real, lady. Reading that after having finished The Seven Sins of Memory, I thought that came off as unprofessional and pretty distasteful, especially when you consider that this book was like a junior neuroscience book. While some people might really like this personality in the writing, I prefer educational material to be a bit drier and to stay on the point more. I think this kind of style in her writing about her life and herself to help illustrate her points does have its audience, and there's certainly nothing wrong with it. But I didn't really like that aspect of the book. Another aspect of this book I didn't care for was that sometimes it began to border on self help, and some of the tips she offers up were either completely obvious or somewhat insensitive. She states that if you have some persisting memories that you'd like to forget, then you should just avoid cues that bring up that memory and just don't think about it. Oh, why didn't I think of that? I wonder what a combat veteran with debilitating PTSD would think reading that. You can't get the images of the carnage you witnessed out of your head? Well, quit thinking about it. But then, this book did have a lot of really good information in it. Some of the things I loved about this book were her descriptions of how memories are formed and her details on the different types of memory. She talks about how memory formation is not like retrieving a video recording, but more like reconstructing and rewriting the memory with each recall. And she goes into the implications of that. I was pleasantly surprised to see that there is a lot of information on Alzheimer's and sleep, which are two subjects in which I have some interest. And also, the book was quite new, so it has modern views with the benefit of current knowledge. You're going to come away better after reading this book. Another thing I really liked about this book was the format. It was very well structured. It's broken into three main parts: how we remember, why we forget, and improve or impair. Each part contains about 6 chapters, and each chapter ended with a return to a point illustrated at the beginning of the chapter as well as a brief recap and transition into the next chapter. And at the end of the book, there was a total recap of each chapter. I can't overstate how much I love when books do this. This kind of structure is so good for increased memory encoding and retention. And for a neuroscientist writing a book about memory, the author was well aware of this, so bravo for that. Excellent formatting. I really wish more educational books would do this. The editing and structure of this book were so good. It didn't have a glossary or an index, but that's because it isn't really that kind of book. I'm not sure I'd even call this a science book, so the subtitle of The Science of Memory could feel slightly misleading. I mean, she does discuss scientific findings, to be fair. It's just that it's very soccer mom. This was written to be very accessible for a wide audience, and I think it achieves this. So it might be a bit unfair to compare it to a bigger psychology book like The Seven Sins of Memory. Having said that, if Lisa Genova can attract attention to this field of study in people who otherwise wouldn't really be interested, then I applaud her for that. This is one of the big struggles of our day. How do we get more people interested in science? I thought the book was pretty good, but I did think that The Seven Sins of Memory was a better book. It just depends on what you're looking for. If you want something light but enlightening, something that you can get through pretty quickly that will stay with you for a while, this was a very enjoyable little book. It's 232 pages, but each page contains a very small word count. So I'm glad I read this, even if it mostly just reinforced stuff that I learned from The Seven Sins of Memory. You know, one of the main reasons I started this channel was to ensure that I would encode and retain more information from what I was reading, as well as to have a recorded description of the material. And I tell you, reviewing these books is forcing me to keep elevated attention levels as I read, and it's really nice. Memory is one of those subjects that if you study, you're going to be rewarded, and this book is going to deliver. So thank you for watching the video. I hope you liked it, and thank you, Dr. Byrne, for recommending this book. If you guys want to get some valuable insight into the formation, storage, and retrieval of your memories, check out Remember by Lisa Genova.